For more than 40 years, I stood at the very center of the financial world, and during that time I passed directly through events etched into humanity's collective memory. When the Gulf War broke out, oil prices doubled in a single night, and I've never forgotten the expressions on the faces gathered around that table. When 9/11 happened, the stock markets closed, and my clients reached out to me by phone asking whether their money still existed. Genuinely, word for word, that is exactly what they asked. When the mortgage market collapsed in 2008, I watched how people sitting atop trillions of dollars became unable to wake up each morning and carry on as though nothing had happened. Then, during the pandemic, I witnessed how the world's largest economies transformed within just a few weeks into something resembling a homeowner's frightened child, trembling as they waited for relief packages. From each crisis, I learned something different, but there was a single point where they all converged. Asset classes that are truly safe appear ordinary under ordinary conditions. They prove their real worth only when the world is burning to ashes in the middle of chaos. Now I look back at 2026, and with this foresight accumulated over 40 years, I have to say this. This time the landscape is different. This time we are not talking about a regional conflict. We are talking about a global game of isolation and domination. The confrontation between major powers is at its peak, not in nuclear warhead counts, but in nuclear rhetoric. Cyber attacks are no longer a prelude to war, but war itself, and economic sanctions have ceased to be a pressure tool and have instead assumed the character of a structural force reshaping the entire global trading order. I am not selling fear here, because fear sells easily, but it never builds security. I am sharing what I learned over 40 years. Trying to protect your portfolio after a crisis has already erupted is like trying to buy insurance after your house has already begun to burn to ashes. It cannot be done not because it is impossible, but because it is too late. At JP Morgan, there is a dedicated team that analyzes geopolitical risk and its impact on financial markets. This team not only analyzes possible scenarios, but also models, layer by layer through historical data, how different asset classes behave under different conditions. In the light of these analyses, there are 4 asset categories that, should a major global conflict scenario unfold, would not merely survive, but would demonstrate value appreciation. And right now I'm going to tell you about those 4 categories directly. The first asset category is physical precious metals, meaning gold and silver that you can directly own and hold in your hands. I know there are many voices echoing in your head right now. Gold is old-fashioned, it pays no dividends, it generates no interest, it delivered mediocre performance over the last decade. But let those voices step aside because they are leading you astray. Gold is not an investment. Gold is insurance taken out against the collapse of everything else. In every major war period, every revolution, every currency crisis, and every social collapse recorded in human history, gold held its value. Paper money yielded to inflation. Government bonds became worthless. Stock markets closed or melted away by 70 to 80%. But gold retained its remaining value and functioned as a medium of value transfer in that chaotic environment. During World War II, while European currencies turned to toilet paper and stock markets locked their doors, physical gold preserved its commercial value. This was not a coincidence. This was a historical pattern that had repeated itself for thousands of years. JP Morgan operates one of the world's largest precious metals vaults. Central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and institutional investors hold gold in this vault. These are not speculators. These are the world's most sophisticated financial institutions, and these institutions hold gold because they truly know what happens during major crises. I need to say this plainly. I am not talking about gold ETFs, gold mining stocks, or gold futures contracts. I am talking about physical gold and silver that you directly own, store securely, and can access regardless of what happens to the banking system or financial markets. In a major global conflict, financial systems can be exposed to cyber attacks. Power grids can be targeted. Banking Trading networks can be taken offline. Digital assets can become temporarily or permanently inaccessible. But physical precious metals do not lose their value and retain their tradability regardless of what happens to digital infrastructure. It is critically important to hold them in forms that are easily recognizable and tradable. Gold coins minted by major government mints. American eagles, Canadian maple leafs. These are instruments widely recognized and accepted around the world. It would be wise to stay away from collectible coins that might be difficult to value or whose sale could prove challenging in a crisis environment. How much should you hold? I recommend holding between 5 and 10% of your total assets in physical precious metals. Position this not as a growth vehicle, but as a safeguard that will protect your purchasing power when everything else collapses. The second asset category is essential commodities and companies serving vital needs. During wartime, luxury consumption rapidly loses its relevance, but people still eat, drink water, consume energy, and continue to meet their medical needs. Businesses that produce or control these fundamental resources generally gain in value during conflict periods. Because demand stays stable or even increases, while supply is most often severely disrupted. Food production companies, agricultural land, water rights, energy infrastructure, these represent tangible, real resources that become extraordinarily valuable during wartime. J.P. Morgan has examined commodity performance during previous wars in depth, and the pattern repeats itself consistently. Essential commodities outpace financial assets because they are representatives of real value, not abstract financial claims. During World War II, agricultural products, oil, steel, and other strategic raw materials experienced sharp price increases. The businesses that controlled these resources continued to generate strong profitability even as stock markets faltered and bonds eroded against inflation. The critical point you need to focus on is this: not businesses that merely have commodity exposure, but businesses that directly control these resources. Owning agricultural land is far more strategic than owning a restaurant chain. Owning energy infrastructure is far more defensive than owning a technology company that consumes energy. To give concrete examples, real estate investment trusts holding agricultural land, energy infrastructure companies operating pipelines and storage facilities, water utility companies in monopolistic positions, mining companies extracting strategic minerals, and food production companies with established distribution networks. However, you must be selective. Not every commodity company is equal. You are looking for strong balance sheets, critical assets that cannot easily be replicated, and operations in politically stable regions that should not be directly affected by conflict. The third asset category is companies in the defense and security space, particularly those with technological superiority and government relationships. This perhaps looks like the most obvious choice, but the subject contains far more nuanced fine points than you might imagine. During major conflicts, governments dramatically increase spending on military equipment, weapons systems, cybersecurity, intelligence gathering, and homeland security. Businesses providing these services and technologies generally experience exponential growth in revenue and profit. But what most people overlook is this: the most valuable defense companies are not necessarily the ones that build tanks or fighter jets. The most valuable are those that provide technology, intelligence, cybersecurity, and specialized services that are difficult to replicate and essential for national security. At J.P. Morgan, we have tracked defense spending patterns across various conflicts and found that the companies that benefit most are generally those with proprietary technology, deep-rooted government relationships, and capabilities that cannot be quickly developed by competitors. Cybersecurity companies rise to an extremely critical position, given that cyber warfare has now become the primary battlefield. Intelligence and surveillance technology companies directly benefit from increased security spending. Companies engaged in advanced manufacturing for secure communications, satellite, technology, and defense applications also see rising demand. What you should focus on is this: not businesses that merely benefit temporarily from temporary increases in defense spending, but businesses with sustainable competitive advantage. You are looking for proprietary technology, security clearances, and long-term government contracts that provide stable revenue streams independent of political changes. Government-contracted cybersecurity companies companies, satellite and communications technology developers, advanced manufacturing companies producing highly specialized defense equipment, and intelligence and surveillance technology providers with deep-rooted government relationships stand out in this category. The fourth and final asset category is strategically located real estate in politically stable regions, endowed with abundant natural resources. Not all real estate is equal during large-scale conflict. Urban properties in major cities can rapidly lose value if those cities are targeted or experience civil unrest, but rural land with agricultural production capacity, access to water, and natural resources can see significant value appreciation during large-scale conflict. When supply chains fragment, when international trade stalls, regions capable of producing their own food, energy, and essential materials gain an enormous advantage. Real estate in these regions frequently experiences sharp value increases as people and capital move away from high-risk centers. J.P. Morgan has observed this pattern emerge repeatedly during regional conflicts. Capital flows to safe havens in real estate in stable regions with strong fundamentals, outpaces the majority of other asset classes during periods of uncertainty. The fundamental characteristics you should look for are political stability, abundant water resources, agricultural potential, energy resources, and geographic isolation from potential conflict zones. Among U.S. regions meeting these criteria, one can count portions of the Mountain West with water access and agricultural potential, areas of the Midwest with productive farmland and energy resources, and certain regions of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand with their geographic isolation and resource wealth. However, you must be far more selective regarding location and property type. Urban residential properties in expensive areas are not strategic real estate. Rural land with water rights, mineral rights, and agricultural potential is strategic real estate. At the same time, you need to account for the practical dimensions of owning these properties and of actually relocating there when necessary. There is no point in owning strategic property if you cannot access it or cannot use it effectively. Now, let me explain why these four asset categories would become more resilient and advantageous than traditional investment instruments in a large-scale global conflict scenario. Traditional financial assets, stocks, bonds, cash, real estate investment trusts, and pension funds depend on the stability of financial systems, government institutions, and economic relationships that could be severely disrupted in a major world war. Stock markets may experience severe volatility or close altogether. Government bonds may erode due to massive deficit spending and currency devaluation. Cash may lose its value due to currency collapse or hyperinflation. Complex financial instruments may lose liquidity or reach a point where they can no longer be valued. But the four asset categories I have identified represent tangible, real value that exists independently of financial systems and government institutions. Physical gold retains its value regardless of what happens to currencies or banks. Essential commodities are valuable because people still need food and energy. Defense companies benefit from increased government spending. Strategic real estate provides shelter and resources regardless of what happens in financial markets. This is not theoretical. We have historical evidence drawn from previous major conflicts that demonstrates these patterns time and again. During World War I, while gold retained its value, European currencies lost between 50 and 90% of their purchasing power. Essential commodities like food and fuel experienced major price increases. Defense contractors generated enormous profits. Agricultural land far from the conflict zones saw sharp value increases. Similar patterns were also observed during World War II. Physical gold and silver preserved their value. Food, energy, and strategic materials gained enormously in value. Defense companies grew. Rural real estate in safe regions left urban properties in targeted cities far behind. Even in more limited conflicts and crises, the same patterns recur. During the Gulf War, oil prices rose sharply while defense sector stocks outpaced the market. After 9/11, gold gained in value while stock markets fell sharply. During the 2008 crisis, treasury bonds and precious metals served as safe havens while other assets collapsed. The fundamental insight is this: during major crises, value flows toward assets representing real tangible resources and away from assets representing financial claims or abstract values. Now let us turn to the practical application of this strategy, because knowing what to own is only half half the battle. For precious metals, you need to establish a secure storage arrangement in advance, not when the need arises, but while there is still no need. This may mean a safe deposit box at a bank, a home security safe, or a professional storage facility. You also need to know how to verify the authenticity of precious metals and how to exchange them under crisis conditions. For essential commodities, you need to focus not merely on commodity exposure, but on companies with strong fundamentals. You are looking for sustainable competitive advantage, strong balance sheets and operations in politically stable regions. In the defense sector, you need to focus on businesses providing advanced technology and critical services rather than simply equipment manufacturing. You are looking for businesses with proprietary capabilities, security clearances, and a diversified client base encompassing both government and commercial customers. For strategic real estate, consider not only properties held purely for investment, but properties you could actually use when necessary. Evaluate factors such as water access, agricultural potential, energy resources, and proximity to like-minded communities. There's no point in owning property and having no realistic plan for relocating there when needed. You also need to think about the timing of these investments, because you do not want to start positioning yourself after a crisis has already begun. Once conflicts start, asset prices generally move quickly and sharply. At J.P. Morgan, we advise clients to build positions in these asset classes gradually, not as a speculative bet, but as a hedging strategy against extreme scenarios. Let me also address the common objections to this strategy. What if World War III never happens? That is precisely the point. These assets function as insurance. If global conflict never occurs, you will have paid a small premium for peace of mind. But if it does occur, these positions could save your financial future. Does this strategy focus too much on negative scenarios? Perhaps. But risk management requires taking into account tail risks that can produce devastating effects. Most people are adequately positioned for normal market conditions, but completely exposed to extreme scenarios. Will these assets not be confiscated during wartime? Historically, governments have sometimes seized gold and other assets during emergencies, but confiscation risk affects all assets, and physical precious metals, along with strategic real estate, are often more amenable to concealment or protection compared to financial assets. Is it not unpatriotic to profit from conflict? The purpose of this strategy is not to profit from war. It is about preserving wealth during extraordinary circumstances and maintaining the capacity to provide for yourself and your family. I want to state this plainly. I hope that no environment will ever arise that makes these investments critical. I hope we avoid major global conflicts and that traditional investment strategies continue to function in a stable manner. However, as someone who has lived through multiple crises and has taken on the responsibility of protecting client assets under any conditions, I believe it is essential to think about how different asset classes would perform in extreme scenarios. The geopolitical risks we face in 2026 are very different from anything we have experienced in decades. Nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, economic interdependence, and technological vulnerabilities are creating new types of systemic risks that previous generations never had to contend with. At J.P. Morgan, we do not forecast specific outcomes. Instead, we make it our guiding principle to remain prepared for numerous scenarios, including the most challenging possibilities. My recommendation is this: maintain your core portfolio of traditional investments that will perform under normal market conditions, but at the same time hold more limited positions in assets, with the potential to preserve their value in extreme scenarios. Think of it as a barbell strategy. The large majority of your assets positioned for normal growth and income, but a meaningful minority position for crisis protection. The 4 asset categories I have identified: physical precious metals, essential commodities, defense technology, and strategic real estate, represent the assets most likely to preserve and grow value during major global disruptions. I hope you never have to rely on these protective measures. But if the most adverse scenarios do materialize, you will clearly come to appreciate the value of having prepared in advance. The decision is yours, but do not wait for everyone else to recognize the risks before you act. By that point, it will be too late to position yourself effectively. The common characteristic of the clients who have built and preserved the most wealth throughout my more than 40 years in finance is that they were clients who remain prepared even for the scenarios they most hoped hoped would never come to pass. Be one of those clients who embraces this discipline.